Hello everybody, welcome to the writing workshop. Today I'm going to give y'all some tips for academic writing as well as anthropological writing specifically. Some of this may be review for some people, but feel free to skip around into the presentation if this is material that you already know. But I want to make sure everyone's on the same page. I meant to put this in the first recording, but I forgot. There's really two ways you can approach this writing workshop and two ways you should approach it. The first way, right, is I'm explaining how to write a good academic paper. But the second thing is I'm explaining the rules that other anthropologists use when they're writing, right? So when you read anything for this course, you can actually start identifying the things that I'm going to talk about in this article. And if you know what to expect in an anthropological essay, and you have these kinds of categories, you can actually read the material much faster, and you can get the information quicker. So there's no one way to do a good academic paper. You're free to experiment, but I'm going to offer you one model that is a kind of generic model that you can use and you can depart from as needed. There are three parts to this workshop. The first one is going to focus on overall structure of your papers. That'll be divided into two other parts. One is general scholarly writing, and the other one is for ethnographic essays in particular. The second section is going to talk about how to do citations using the American Anthropological Association study guide, and the writing guide, style guide, and the third piece is going to talk about how to do quotations. Each paper needs to conclude each of these 5 aspects. Additionally, your papers should follow these style guidelines. Use a font that's easily legible. It shouldn't be fancy type cursive, just something that's easy to read like Times New Roman. That last point from the last slide might be confusing for some folks, so I just wanted to explain what I meant with an example. Each new paragraph, you should hit return once. There should be one space. There should not be any extra spaces. So the top you see, this is what I mean, this is what it should look like. And the bottom one is what your paper should not look like. Now, Word is funny, and you can get this bad look that I don't like, that I don't want you to do, in two ways. You can either hit return twice, but sometimes Word will automatically add in extra spaces at the end of paragraphs, so you'll have to go back and fix that in the formatting. As a rule of thumb, academic papers have 3 basic parts: the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. Now, ethnographic papers are a variation on this, but I'm going to get into that later on. Your introduction should do 2 things. It should have a thesis, and it should have a map or an outline. Basically, by the end of the introduction, I should be able to say what this paper is about, what the argument is, how you're going to make that argument, what your logic is, and then what kinds of evidence are you using to support it. So your thesis states your core argument. That should be stated up front in the beginning. And then the outline kind of unpacks the different parts of how you're getting to your argument, how you're supporting it, what kind of ethnographic material you're using. For example, I should know if you're doing an interview with someone that's your data set. I need all of this information by the end of the first paragraph. One mistake that students often make in anthropology papers is they start the first sentence off with a broad generalization, something along the lines of, in all human societies, such and such and such. Now, the first problem is that whenever you make a broad generalization about human nature or human society or something like that, you're almost always going to be wrong. And so the result is that you've basically just wasted a bunch of space saying something wrong that doesn't actually help your argument. So if you find that if you've started your paper off that way, here's a hint. Just select that whole chunk of the first introduction and hit delete, and your paper will stand alone without it, and it will be better if you just take that section out. Now, I have given you an alternative. If you want to use it, you don't have to use this alternative opening. But one way to do an anthropological paper is to say, okay, so it's commonly believed such and such is the case. However, I am using this ethnographic evidence, which shows something else is the case. Now, different people writing on different things may or not be able to make that kind of argument with their paper. For example, you may not be able to make that paper if you're observing a park, people walking through a park, but it is a kind of model that may be useful. Moving on to the second part of the papers is the body paragraphs, right? This is all the meat of the paper between the introduction and the conclusion. Now, each body paragraph needs to do at least two things. It needs to have a topic sentence. That's the first sentence, and it just says, it explains the point of that paragraph. Why is this paragraph here? What are you saying? How does this relate to the thesis? The rest of the paragraph is then unpacking your assertion, supporting it with evidence. You might draw on your ethnographic materials to support your assertions. You might draw on materials from the readings. But each body paragraph needs to have a topic and then support to justify that topic. I forgot to say in the other recording, but what this means, right, is that basically each paragraph says one thing, just in long form, right? So keep that in mind, right? Each paragraph should be about one core idea. If there's 2 or 3 core ideas in your paragraph, that's too many. That should be multiple paragraphs. And each of those core ideas needs to be supported with evidence. The final part of your paper then is the conclusion. And again, this should do two things. You should reiterate what the main point of the paper is, hammering it home, hammering your argument home. And then you should answer the question of, so what? Why does any of this matter? Now from here, I want to take a step back and move from the structure of writing to how do you actually write? What is your process? Now, different people have different writing processes, and you should do what works for you. Some people are very linear. They need to start from the beginning. They need a thesis before they can move on, and they have to do one piece by piece by piece by piece. Other people are more nonlinear. I fall into the nonlinear camp. When I write, I start with the ethnography, and I write that. And as I'm writing the ethnography, I kind of start getting a better sense of what my analysis of that ethnography is. And so then I write the analysis. I write the body. Basically, I'm writing the body paragraphs first. Then I come back and write the introduction at the very end. And so by the end, once I've written the body, I have a pretty good idea what my thesis is, but I can't write the thesis first. That just doesn't work for me. Now, this also happens on a smaller scale. For example, I write a paragraph, and I know each paragraph, I know there's a point, but I haven't quite gotten it. I haven't quite figured out what it is explicitly in my brain when I start writing. But usually by the time I'm maybe 4 or 5 sentences in, or maybe it's even the last sentence, I'll figure out what that topic sentence is, and I'll write it naturally. So the trick I then do is when I write that topic sentence later on in the paragraph, I just copy paste it to the beginning, right? I just copy paste that sentence to the beginning of the paragraph. And voila, there's my topic. That way that works well for me because I don't have all the ideas fleshed out until I actually go through the writing process. And the writing process helps me work through my ideas. Now, no matter what you do, if you write in a linear way or a nonlinear way, you will likely find that you will have to revise what you thought your thesis would be in the beginning. You've written the rest of your paper and you realize, actually, I'm arguing this other thing, not what I originally thought, but this other thing, which is actually, and that process is good. That means as you've written the paper, you've thought more deeply about the material and your analysis has gone deeper, right? So that's good scholarship. And so go ahead and revise that thesis once you're done. it'll be much stronger if you do that. So the tips in the above slides have been focused on paper writing in a kind of general analytical mode, a general academic paper. Here I want to talk about anthropology and ethnography specifically. Because the thing is, the structure of an ethnographic description is often going to be quite different from other body paragraphs. It'll often be quite different than the structure I actually just outlined. Because the reason for that is that an ethnographic description, the point of that is not necessarily to make an argument. You're not presenting a topic sentence with supporting evidence. Instead, ethnographic sections often tell a story. They provide a sense of detail, right, of social life, and then later parts of the essay go back and analyze that. You can think of, for example, Paige West does this in her writing all the time, where she has these dense theoretical sections, but then she has the ethnography where she talks about people's lives and tells their stories. And she keeps those sections separate, right? But they complement each other and they support each other. So there's different ways of doing this. Often people do keep these ethnographic sections and analytical sections separately, or ethnography and theoretical sections. But you can really do whatever works for you. If it makes more sense to weave them together more fluidly, that's fine. To alternate back and forth, that's totally fine. Again, there's no one way of doing it. But when you are doing your ethnography, try to paint a vivid picture, right? Try and help the reader imagine what you're talking about. Set the scene so they really see a picture. And the aim here, again, is not always going to be to make an argument. Now, there's going to be an implicit argument in your ethnographic description section, no matter what. Like, you're making decisions about what to include and what not to include in a pretty limited page count, and those decisions are going to reflect the argument you're making. But at the same time, the goal is also in some way to kind of just paint a picture so that the reader can then decide, like, okay, based on this description, are these conclusions good? Are they valid? So based on what I'm saying, right, an ethnographic description can often be a very different kind of writing, a different style of writing with different aims than the analysis itself, right? And these can often be thought of as two separate kinds of aspects of your paper. So here's a kind of basic structure that you're free to use in your papers. Again, you can depart from it, but this is a kind of basic anthropological structure. You have your introduction, then you have the ethnographic description, then you have a separate section that analyzes the ethnography, and then you conclude. Now, you might notice, as I've been talking about with Paige West, right, Paige West basically scales this model up and does it on a big scale, where she has an introduction, she has an analysis or theory, she has some ethnographic descriptions, then she'll analyze those descriptions, then she'll have some more ethnography, then she'll have more analysis, then she'll have another section of ethnography, and then she'll have another section of analysis, and then she'll conclude, right? So she's basically taking this model and just kind of repeating it over and over again. I should have added in that last recording that if you use this kind of basic structure, the introduction's going to be a paragraph, the conclusion's going to be a paragraph. So you might have a page and a half, or 2 pages of ethnographic description, and then a page to 2 pages of analysis, and you're at 5 pages right there. Or at least 3 to 5 pages. So that would be a totally appropriate structure for the paper. But again, you're going to have to figure out what works for you, what makes sense in terms of your own writing style, and your own thinking in terms of what you want to do with the ethnography. So here's just a good tip for papers, and this is something that I'm always looking for when I'm grading your papers. I'm looking for how deeply do you draw on the details and the richness of the details that you offer in your ethnographic materials. And the deeper you go into those details, the stronger your conclusions are going to be, right? This is often something that students struggle with because students often think very abstractly, I find. They think, abstractly, right? But if you're focusing on the details, right, the details can actually complicate the abstractions. The richness of social life, of our empirical everyday experiences, are so much more complicated than our generalizations and so much more interesting than our generalizations. And so if you're drawing on that richness as a resource, you can really build much more nuanced and complex conclusions out of them. So a question here, right, is how do you connect the ethnographic detail with your broader arguments or abstractions, right? And you should be working to connect these things in your papers. And of course, part of this is, right, your conclusions should emerge from your ethnography as opposed to the other way around. And that's good scientific practice, right? Our conclusions should be shaped by our analysis of real people's lives, not by our preconceptions. Of course, that's like a goal that's easier said than done, but it's a goal that we work towards, even if no anthropologist can ever do that perfectly. So when you're writing, talking about the process of writing, there's really 3 different stages. And I recommend keeping these stages separate, right? Don't do this multiple steps at the same time. The first step is coming up with an outline. What are the kinds of core pieces of what you're trying to write about? What are the different components of the paper? And you can break this into sections or into paragraphs, right? What is the material you're going to cover? What is your main idea? How are you going to support that? And the outline can be really helpful for a lot of folks in terms of organizing their thoughts before they start putting them onto paper. So a simple way of organizing, right, is just you have a description of the different sections. For example, you might have ethnographic section, analysis section, to go back to the earlier model. And then you have a line that talks about what are the kinds of basic ideas or paragraphs. And as a subpoint, you have how are you going to support that argument? What are you drawing on in terms of the ethnography? What kinds of readings are you going to draw from? Again, this is just to organize your thoughts and outline the paper before you get started writing. The next step is, of course, writing the paper. And I want to emphasize, right, that you should not edit while you're writing. Some people really struggle to make each sentence perfect as they go. I'm not going to tell you that there's a single right way to do it or a wrong way to do it, but I think for the vast majority of cases, that is extremely unproductive. When you're writing, the point is just to get everything on paper. You know, it's not to make it pretty. It's just to kind of get through and get everything written, get everything draft. And when you're done, you should have a rough draft, not a complete draft. And so if you end up spending a lot of time focusing on exactly what word you want to use or how you want to phrase each sentence, that can interrupt the larger flow of ideas, right? That can interrupt your writing flow. So I would keep writing and editing separate processes. Once you have your rough draft, again, it can be shitty. The goal is just to have something on paper, you know? It's just to have something written. But after you've done that, you can go back and edit it. You can clean up the language. You can clarify ideas that you didn't feel like you did the best job articulating. You can make the language nicer and neater. You can make it pretty, essentially. During this stage, you can also copy-paste things. As I said earlier, right, you may find, I actually got to the topic sentence 7 lines into this paragraph. So I'm just going to copy that topic sentence and move it to the top of the paragraph. Or, I actually figured out my thesis was when I wrote it in like page 3 or something. And it just came out then naturally, but I'll just copy that thesis that came out in the middle and paste that to the introductory paragraph. So all of this is the editing process, right? And again, keep that process of editing separate from writing. Because when you're writing, you just want to you want to be able to get into the flow of ideas. When you're editing, you're trying to make it nice and presentable. I will never see the intermediate stages of your writing, right? So the first draft doesn't have to be good as long as if you turn in something that's more edited. On the other hand, if an emergency happens, you can turn in the rough draft and you'll get a lower grade, but it'll be done. And a done paper is always going to receive a much higher grade than a paper that's not completed, right? This is the difference between a 0 and something that will probably be in the range of 60 to, at the minimum, to 85, right? That's a huge difference. I should add, if you have a real emergency, you can of course get an extension. That was just a thing that popped into my mind. But, shit happens. And even if I don't necessarily recommend you turn in the rough draft, unless you absolutely have to, I find personally it also just alleviates stress to be able to say, okay, I do have something that I can turn in the worst case scenario. I find that personally that alleviates a lot of stress around assignments. Here's an example of an alternative kind of structure that you can use, but I certainly at least want to make you well aware of because it's something that is used often in the articles that we read. Often an author will start with an ethnographic vignette rather than the introduction, the way I've laid it out. So they have this opening description that it's a short passage that speaks to the major issues of the paper. And then following that opening vignette is the introduction, which explains the thesis and does all the other things that I described an introduction should do earlier in the presentation. However, in a 3 to 5 page paper, you might just not have enough space. This is certainly something you're welcome to do if you want and if that works for your paper. It's not something you're required to do, but it is something that you will see a lot of the authors we read doing, right? And again, when you think about this writing workshop, part of it is how do I give you skills for writing ethnographic papers, and the other half of it is becoming more familiar with how anthropologists write, which will then help you read through the material we cover in class much faster, because you can kind of group these things into categories and say, oh, here's the ethnographic vignette. Here's why they have this vignette, and here's what they're trying to get at. Here's the introduction. Oh, there's the thesis. Now I know what this whole thing is about. Here's the body paragraph. Here's the topic. Being able to identify these elements of the writing can ultimately make it easy to read much faster and really even skim. So this is now the second section of the presentation. We're shifting from the questions of structure, from essay structure, to style, to citations. This is just information that's useful to know. Whenever you talk about an article title or a chapter title, you should put that in quotation marks. On the other hand, books, films, and other kinds of standalone works, they should be italicized. You can think of this, right, if it's a smaller piece of a larger work, it gets quotation marks. If it's the larger work, it gets italicized. So here's my example. Beginning fieldwork is a chapter in the ethnography Homegirls. Beginning fieldwork is a chapter, so it goes in quotations. Homegirls is a book, so that's italicized. So citations are really important, right? Because this is how you attribute ideas that you've gotten from other people to them. This is how you avoid plagiarism, right? By saying like, okay, this is so-and-so says this, right? And you cite them. And the way some people talk about this, right, is that as scholars, we stand on the shoulders of giants to see further. And those giants are the people who've written things before us. And by building on their insights, we are ultimately able to see further and deeper into the social world. And so we want to give them good credit where credit is due. So your papers should all include two aspects of citations. There should be in-text citations, which should follow the author date format, and a bibliography. I'll explain what I mean by that later, but the bibliography should use the AAA Manual of Style. You can follow this link there and get a quick guide for how to cite, for example, chapters, articles, books, etc. And when you're citing, you should always make sure that you are citing the text, the edition of the text you're using. So the big example of that's going to be conformity and conflict. If you're using the 2012 edition, make sure you're citing the 2012 edition. I've given you an example here. I'm using the 2015 edition. You can cite the original publication if you want in brackets. You don't need to do that, but that is something you will sometimes see. Here's how you do it. But the aim here, right, is whenever you cite someone, I should be able to go back and find the exact page you're talking about and check to make sure the citation is correct, right? And even when I write an article as a professional anthropologist, I do the same thing, so that way my peers, my colleagues, other scholars can look back and check on my work and say, okay, yeah, this is where that idea comes from, and here's what maybe Lee understood very well, here's what they're doing with it that's interesting, but maybe I missed something important and someone can identify that. So let's talk about in-text citations. Every time you cite someone, you should include their name and the year of the publication in parentheses. Now, you can play with this because basically what I need is the name and the year. Those are the pieces of information that you need. So whether you put all of that in parentheses like the first example, or some of it's in parentheses and some of it's kind of in the main text, that's up to you, If you want to say something like, Mendoza-Dinton argues that da-da-da-da-da, right? This is how you do that in that second example. If you're talking about something from a specific passage, or you're quoting a specific passage, then you should also include the page number, and I've given you instructions for how to do that. And again, I've shown you how to do it where it's all in the parentheses, the author and the date are both in the parentheses, and where the author's name and the date are kind of broken apart. So if you have the author date in parentheses, for example, West 2016, as in the first example, that goes at the end of your sentence, followed by the period. However, if you have the author in the main text, the author's name in the main text, according to Page West, or Page West says such and such, you can then just put the date and, if necessary, the page number after the author's name, and that's fine too. If it is not clear, in the second set of examples cited from Page West, I am, of course, slightly misrepresenting what she says, which is bad scholarship, but I'm doing it for the sake of humor in what could otherwise be a quite boring conversation. So I just want to make sure everyone knows I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek here. Don't actually go to your economist professors and say, well, this is what Lee says. Economists are all racists. The third and final piece of this writing workshop is how to quote properly. There are two different kinds of quotes, and let me start by saying you may quote from not only course materials, but also your informants in the case of an ethnographic essay. And there's two kinds of quotes, right? There's the shorter quotes and longer quotes, or block quotes. Now, different people will have different guidelines for what the difference between a short quote and a long quote should be. For example, I publish in academic journals where different journals have different guidelines, right? And you just follow the journal. For the case of this class, I'm not going to, it doesn't need to be super precise because, again, in any kind of formal publication, you should follow the guidelines of that publication. But for the purposes of this class, let's say a short quote should be about 4 to 6 lines or less. So if your quote is less than 4 to 6 lines or 4 to 6 lines or any shorter than that, that quote should be in quotation marks and it should go in the main body of the paragraph. This is different from a block quote. So if it's longer than 4 to 6 lines, that's a block quote. And what you do is you hit return at the beginning and the end of the quotation. So that way it stands apart from the rest of the article. From the rest of the paragraph. Block quotes do not have quotation marks, but they are indented on the left and right sides on the left and right margins of the paper. They're also single-spaced, whereas the rest of your paper should be double-spaced. Block quotes go in single spaces. I'll give you some examples of what shortened block quotes look like in the next couple slides. But the last piece I want to say, is that there's actually different protocols for when you cite following a short quote that are different than the block quote. So in a short quote, the citation, the author date citation, goes after the quote, but before the punctuation. So in my example, write blah, 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 end quote, parentheses, Bohannon 2015, page 44, end quote, and then the period goes at the end after the author date quote citation. Block quotes are different. In a block quote, the citation actually goes after the punctuation. So for example, you have the quote blah, 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 period, then parentheses, author date citation. So here's an example of a short quote. This is a screenshot from an article that I have coming out in a journal in a couple months. And what I've done is I've quoted Monique Mojica in the kind of middle of the screenshot. And it's a little bit of a longer quote, but in this context, in this journal, they said I should do it in I should have this quote in the body of the paragraph. So you can see there's no separation between the quotation and the paragraph in terms of formatting. But the quotation is in quotation marks. Now what I've done in this case, is I have, before the quote, this introductory setup that says, the playwright Monique Mojica writes blah, 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 blah. So I've actually put the date following the author, as well as the page number. Now that's totally fine. You can totally do that. But if I hadn't done that, for example, if I didn't have her name in here, I would say, if I didn't have this whole chunk, the Kuna and Rappahannock playwright Monique Mojica, and I just had the quote, I could then put the author date at the end of the quotation. So it would say, as they fell into decline, end quotations, parentheses, Mojica, 2012, 219, period. Another thing worth noting here is in the above examples, after the date and between the date and the page number, I've been using semicolons, but this particular journal uses commas. So again, that's a little arbitrary. I'm not really concerned, but you should be consistent in your own essays for the purposes of this class. Here's a couple other small notes that are worth mentioning. In this quote from Mojica, she actually has parts of her writing are themselves in quotation marks when she talks about language and signage that declares our cultures abandoned as they fell into decline. You can't see me, but I'm doing air quotes as I read this. But you might be able to hear the air quotes in my intonation. So what I've done is I've done these kinds of single quotation mark things. I don't know what they're called, instead of the double mark quotation marks that you usually use. So whenever you're quoting someone who uses quotation marks in the thing you're quoting, this is how you do it. The last bit is after you quote someone, you should always explain what the quote is about and the significance of the quote. You shouldn't just leave the quote hanging. The quote should never be at the end of the paragraph. You shouldn't assume your reasoning is self-evident to the reader. You need to, after every quote, say, okay, so here's what this quote is saying, and here's why this is significant. Unpack the quote, essentially. So here's an example of a block quote from a different article that I've published. And so again, just note that this is not a super long block quote, but again, because this was a different journal, their protocols was that this, because it was 5 lines, it should be in a block quote. So just ignore that for now, because for the sake of this class, it doesn't matter. So this is what a block quote looks like. As you can see, the text is set apart from the main paragraph. The quote is indented from the left and the right margins, but there's no quotation marks around it, right? The block quoting is enough. You don't need quotation marks on top of that. Now again, the way I've written it, I have the author and the date are up earlier in the quotation mark in the paragraph. So I didn't need to reiterate that information because the reader already has it. But I do have, at the end of the block quote, the page number. And again, you can see I have the quotation, which ends, "to be read over and over again for all who visit, period, parentheses, citation." This is in contrast to the smaller in-text quotes, in which the punctuation goes after the citation. Another thing worth noting is that once the quotation ends, the next line, "how suggests that the mound tells a story," that's actually part of the same paragraph. This is me talking about her argument more and unpacking the quote and her argument more. So there's no indentation because the paragraph is just resuming following the block quote. It's still the same paragraph, so I don't need a new indentation. Now, what is different in this example from what you will see in your own writing, right, is because this is a published journal article, this is single-spaced. So what they've done is slightly different, where they have an extra space between my writing and the quotation mark, and then the quotation is slightly smaller font size. But because you're writing something that is because you're writing something that's not typeset and published in a formal journal, what you're going to do is you don't actually need this extra space above and below the quote. You just need it to be set apart and indented on the left and right. And in fact, when I submitted this article to the journal, I submitted it in Word, right? And the text that I wrote was actually double-spaced. It didn't put the quotation was then single-spaced, in contrast to the rest of the essay, which was double-spaced. And it didn't have these extra lines. It just had the indentions on either side. But when the publication typesets it, when they put everything in the format for the ultimate publication, they then change the formatting to be more in line with the way they like their journal to look, as opposed to the way we tend to write in Word documents. So I know that's a little confusing because there are some things here that are different from the way you should be writing your papers, but hopefully that offers some clarification. Unlike what you see here, your block quotes are going to be single-spaced, and they don't need to have a line above and below them. They can just, Okay, so I recorded that last slide and then realized it'll just be easier for me just to show you what I mean. So this is the same passage from the published article, but this is a copy of the Word document, the manuscript that I wrote and submitted to the journal. And as you can see, right, it's double-spaced. The block quote is single-spaced. It's set apart from the rest of the text. The quote ends over and over again for all who visit, period, parentheses, citation. And then the next, then the paragraph continues immediately following the quote, and there's no second indentation because that's still part of the same paragraph. That's me continuing to unpack Leanne Howe's argument. So that's all the information that I have for you for the writing workshop. If you have any questions or need clarification, go ahead and you can ask that in the questions for instructor discussion forum for this week. I'm also going to create a much shorter lecture for the readings, so keep an eye out for that as well.